December 4th, 1971. Deep in the Rajasthan desert, a small Indian border post stood surrounded by endless sand dunes. Its name was Longewala. It had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no large defensive fortifications. Around 120 Indian soldiers guarded the post with limited weapons, unaware that one of the biggest tests of their lives was only hours away. As midnight approached, the desert grew silent. Then, a faint rumble echoed across the dunes. At first it sounded like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound grew louder with every passing minute. A soldier climbed onto the observation post and looked through his binoculars. Tiny lights appeared on the horizon. Within moments, it became clear that this was no convoy of trucks. A large Pakistani armored force was advancing toward Longewala. Outnumbered and with no immediate reinforcements, the defenders had only one choice: stand their ground. Before sunrise, this forgotten outpost would become the site of one of the most remarkable defensive battles in modern military history. But to understand how they ended up there, we have to go back a few days. Chapter 1. The Road to War. To understand the Battle of Longewala, we first need to look at the events that led to the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. At the time, Pakistan was divided into two separate regions, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, separated by more than 1,600 kilometers of Indian territory. Although they were one country, the people of East Pakistan felt increasingly marginalized politically and economically. Tensions reached a breaking point after the 1970 general election, when the Awami League won a majority, but was prevented from forming the government. Protests soon turned into a violent conflict, forcing millions of civilians to flee into neighboring India. The massive refugee crisis placed enormous pressure on India, while relations between the two countries rapidly deteriorated. Then, on the evening of December 3, 1971, Pakistan launched preemptive airstrikes against several Indian air bases. India responded immediately, and within hours, full-scale war had begun. While the world's attention was fixed on the fighting in the east, another battle was quietly taking shape hundreds of kilometers away in the deserts of Rajasthan, where a small border post called Longewala was about to find itself at the center of history. Chapter 2. Pakistan's Plan. While the main objective of the war lay in East Pakistan, Pakistan also launched an offensive on the Western Front to divide India's attention and gain strategic advantages. One of its key targets was the small border post of Longewala in Rajasthan. The plan was ambitious. Pakistani forces intended to capture the post, advance rapidly toward Ramgarh, and potentially threaten Jaisalmer, disrupting Indian supply lines and forcing India to divert troops from the Eastern Front. Leading the attack was a powerful armored column supported by infantry, confident that the lightly defended border post would fall within hours. On paper, the odds were overwhelmingly in Pakistan's favor. But what looked like a straightforward advance across the desert would soon encounter unexpected obstacles, determined defenders, and a series of decisions that would change the course of the battle. Chapter 3. The Defenders of Longewala. At Longewala, the responsibility for holding the post rested with Major Kuldip Singh Chandpuri of the Indian Army's 23 Punjab Regiment. Under his command were around 120 soldiers, stationed at a remote outpost with limited resources. They had no tanks to match an armored assault, only a few recoilless rifles, machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank mines. Communication with higher headquarters was maintained through radio, but any reinforcements would take hours to arrive across the harsh desert terrain. As reports of Pakistani troop movements began to come in, Major Chandpuri faced a difficult choice. He could withdraw and preserve his men, or stay and defend the post against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. After assessing the situation, he made his decision. Longewala would not be abandoned. His men strengthened their defenses, laid additional mines where possible, prepared their weapons and waited in the darkness for the enemy to arrive, knowing that by dawn they would either have held the post or made their last stand. Chapter 4. The battle begins. On the night of December 4th, 1971, the silence of the Rajasthan desert was shattered by the deep rumble of engines. A large Pakistani armored column, supported by infantry, moved steadily across the sand toward Longewala under the cover of darkness. The attackers were confident that the isolated border post would fall quickly. From their perspective, it was a lightly defended position that could be captured within a matter of hours, clearing the way for a deeper advance into Indian territory. At Longewala, Major Kuldip Singh Chandpuri and his men remained calm. They had already taken up their defensive positions, fully aware that they were heavily outnumbered. Every soldier understood that ammunition was limited and that every round had to be used carefully. As the enemy closed in, Chandpuri gave a simple order: hold your fire until the tanks were well within range. The tension grew with every passing minute. The sound of tank tracks became louder, and the outlines of armored vehicles slowly emerged from the darkness. Then, when the leading tanks entered range, the Indian defenders opened fire. Recoilless rifles struck the advancing armor while machine guns targeted the accompanying infantry. The first explosions lit up the desert, destroying the lead vehicles and forcing the rest of the column to slow down. Instead of sweeping past the post as planned, the attackers suddenly found themselves facing determined resistance. The darkness, uneven desert terrain, and uncertainty about the strength of the defenders added to the confusion. Some Pakistani vehicles struggled to navigate the sandy ground, while others halted to avoid driving into suspected minefields. Throughout the night, Indian soldiers continued to engage the advancing force from their prepared positions, making the most of every weapon they had. At the same time, radio operators repeatedly called for air support, knowing that if help didn't arrive by morning, holding the post would become increasingly difficult. As the battle raged through the night, the defenders had only one objective: survive until sunrise. Chapter 5. Dawn changes everything. The fighting continued throughout the night. Pakistani tanks repeatedly tried to push toward the Longewala post, but every advance was met with determined resistance. Whenever a tank moved into range, the Indian defenders fired their recoilless rifles with remarkable precision, forcing the attackers to slow down and rethink their approach. Machine guns and mortars kept the accompanying infantry at a distance, preventing them from mounting a coordinated assault on the post. The darkness, combined with the unfamiliar desert terrain, created further confusion for the attacking force. Fearing hidden minefields and unsure of the defenders' true strength, many armored vehicles halted or changed direction, causing the long column to lose momentum. What was expected to be a swift breakthrough gradually turned into a prolonged and chaotic battle. Inside the post, the situation remained tense. The Indian soldiers had been fighting for hours with limited ammunition, knowing they could not afford to waste a single round. Radio operators stayed in constant contact with higher headquarters, repeatedly requesting air support while updating the situation on the ground. Major Kuldip Singh Chandpuri understood that his mission was no longer to defeat the attacking force on his own. His objective was to delay the enemy for as long as possible. Every passing minute brought them closer to sunrise, when the balance of the battle could finally change. As dawn broke on December 5th, 1971, the first rays of sunlight revealed the battlefield. The Pakistani armored column, spread across the open desert, had little natural cover. Many tanks and vehicles were stationary, while others were still trying to find a safe route through the difficult terrain. It was exactly the opportunity the Indian Air Force had been waiting for. From Jaisalmer Air Force Station, Hunter fighter aircraft were scrambled to support the defenders. Flying at low altitude, the pilots quickly identified the exposed armored vehicles and began a series of devastating attacks using rockets, 30-millimeter cannon fire, and bombs. Wave after wave of aircraft struck tanks, armored personnel carriers, fuel trucks, and supply vehicles. Thick columns of smoke soon rose across the desert as vehicles burst into flames and ammunition detonated. The open landscape, which had seemed ideal for an armored advance, now left the Pakistani column completely exposed from the air. The airstrikes continued throughout the morning, making it impossible for the attackers to reorganize or resume their advance. Vehicles that attempted to move became easy targets, while those that remained stationary faced repeated attacks. With mounting losses, damaged equipment, and no realistic way to achieve their objective, the Pakistani force was forced to abandon much of its armor and begin withdrawing from Longewala. By the end of the battle, the small border post had not only survived, but had helped inflict one of the most significant setbacks of the Western campaign. The determination of its defenders during the night, combined with the decisive intervention of the Indian Air Force at first light, had turned what appeared to be an inevitable defeat into a remarkable victory. Chapter 6. The Desert That Remembered. As the battle came to an end, the desert around Longewala was transformed into a graveyard of burned-out tanks, destroyed armored vehicles, and abandoned equipment. What had begun as a confident Pakistani advance had ended in a costly retreat. The small border post, expected to fall within hours, had remained in Indian hands. The victory at Longewala was more than a successful defense of a remote outpost. It halted Pakistan's advance in this sector and highlighted the importance of leadership, preparation, and coordination between the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force. Throughout the night, the defenders held their ground against overwhelming odds, buying the precious time needed for air support to arrive at first light. Together, the soldiers on the ground and the hunter pilots in the sky turned the tide of the battle. For his leadership, Major Kuldip Singh Chandpuri was awarded the Mahavir Chakra, while many of the soldiers who fought beside him were also recognized for their bravery. Today, Longewala stands as one of the defining battles of the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War and remains a symbol of determination in the face of overwhelming odds. More than 50 years later, the winds still sweep across the same desert, but the story of Longewala has never faded. It reminds us that victory is not always decided by numbers or firepower. Sometimes it belongs to those who refuse to give up, hold their ground, and stand together when it matters most.